I mean, it seems pretty straightforward to me. Whether an action is good or evil simply depends on whether the consequences of the action are good or bad. Well, that's just obviously untrue. Well, sometimes bad actions can have good results, or vice versa. For example, should a doctor kill one healthy patient, cut his organs out, and redistribute them to 5 sick dying patients who would be saved by those organs? Well, obviously not. This would have good results on net, 4 lives saved, but it's still murder and therefore evil. So morality isn't determined by consequences. Well, that action may not have good results. You're leaving out the possibility that I'll be caught and the damage that that will do to trust in the medical profession. You're also leaving out the chance that I will screw up one or more of the requisite surgeries, resulting in more death. You're also leaving out the question of how many years of life the healthy patient would have had compared to how many years of life the sick patients will get on their stolen organs. And not to mention quality of life, which we haven't even touched yet. Like, you're just fighting the hypothetical at this point. Assume all of those risks are negligible and their lives are otherwise identical. Yeah, but now you're just making the hypothetical totally implausible, therefore unintuitive. Which is a problem because your argument relies on my moral intuition that the doctor did something wrong. Of course, my moral intuition will give me the wrong answer when you ask me to assume away factors that are too obviously important to ignore. But there is a famous hypothetical that resolves this: the trolley problem. There's a trolley hurtling down some train tracks. There are 5 people tied to the tracks in front of it. You can pull a lever that diverts it down another track where only one person is tied up. However, you will have then caused that one person's death rather than simply failing to prevent the deaths of the other 5. Now that we have a situation where the obvious and intuitive risks are absent in the hypothetical, rather than present but supposed to be assumed away like in yours, it becomes obvious what the right choice is. Pull the lever for consequentialism. I don't agree that the answer in that situation is so obvious. I don't actually think you should pull the lever. Yeah, but all I need to do to get you to agree with me is to raise the stakes. Let's say instead of 5 people on the tracks in front of you, there's a button on the tracks, and when the trolley runs over it, it'll cause a bomb to explode, destroying the entire world, killing everyone except somehow the person on the alternate track. Well, now whose hypothetical is becoming contrived and unintuitive? In any case, I still don't think the answer is clear. I can't believe you're actually thinking about biting the bullet on this one. Basically, nobody would say that you should accept the extinction of humanity in order to follow some contrived ethical maxim. Well, I don't know about that. Let's ask that guy over there. Hey buddy, what do you think?
Your prattle amuses me. Good, evil, these are meaningless constructs that humans bicker about incessantly, never willing to realize the obvious truths. There is no morality. The universe is cold and indifferent to your meaningless gibbering about what ought to be. There is only what is in this vast, uncaring universe. Reason will not save you from the blunt impact of reality. It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of my finger.
A moral nihilist is someone who sees morality as just a silly superstition. Someone who believes that ultimately there is no right or wrong. A moral nihilist will hear 2 people arguing, one trying to convince the other that some act is morally wrong, and he will scoff. The scoffing may come accompanied by some caveat of, well, morality is perhaps useful in some sense, but there's still something fundamentally irrational about it. At the extreme, moderate? The extremely moderate end of the spectrum, a moral nihilist may even say that, whilst moral nihilism is technically true, he still acts as though morality were real. I am going to argue against this view. There is a real aspect of reality that conforms so well to our intuitive concept of morality that it would be ridiculous if we did not call it morality. First, though, I want to broaden my attack. I want to make sure I'm responding to all moral nihilists, including the moral nihilists who don't know that they are moral nihilists. If your position on morality is might makes right, you are also a moral nihilist. If, when confronted with a question about morality, you simply brush it off with, oh, morality is just subjective, then you also are a moral nihilist. I am now telling people what they are, which people tend not to like. I had better justify myself pretty quickly. Might makes right.
To be fair, this statement is sometimes used for purposes other than moral nihilism. Sometimes it's meant to make the point that whatever your idea of morality is, it's pretty inconsequential if you don't have the power to enforce it. If you're using it in this way, then just be sure you're not using it to respond to a moral claim. If I say, I think this thing is immoral, and you chortle and say, the only morality is might makes right, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must, then, despite how cool you might think that makes you sound, it's off topic. You may be correct. My understanding of morality may be entirely impotent if I am without might, but that says nothing about whether an act is or is not, in fact, moral. But this is all with respect to a non-literal interpretation of the statement might makes right, which doesn't actually make a direct statement about morality at all. If we instead take the statement might makes right literally, then it actually carries an implication of moral nihilism. Taken literally, the claim might makes right means that whatever the mighty do is necessarily right. Presumably might, in this context, is not just physical strength, but whatever ability you use to manifest your will in reality. Intelligence is a type of might, popularity is a type of might, and so on. By this definition, nothing can happen that is not an example of might prevailing. If anything happens that you didn't want to happen, then you were not the one with the might, and so what the mighty determine is indistinguishable from just what happens. Instead of might makes right, you may as well just be saying whatever happens is right. Furthermore, if might really is right, then nothing can happen that is not right either. If everything that happens is necessarily right, then right, in a moral sense, is also indistinguishable from what happens. If you enter a discussion about morality and you effectively say, what happens is what happens, you're either failing to make a relevant comment, or you're trying to say that you don't believe in morality at all. Therefore, to the extent that it's even a relevant thing to say in a conversation about morality, the statement might makes right is just a way of saying that there is no right. It just manages to sound even more like teenage angst. Morality is subjective. This is another way that people try to say that they don't believe in morality without actually saying it. First of all, I want to get this out of the way because it's bafflingly common. Whether morality is subjective is nothing to do with whether we disagree on it. Often people will say, oh, well, this one guy or this one culture considers this act to be immoral, while this other guy or this other culture considers it to be perfectly fine. So morality is really subjective. That doesn't logically follow at all. Cultures and individuals disagree on scientific claims as well. That doesn't make scientific claims subjective. Not all cultures realized that the Earth was round, but that didn't make the shape of the Earth subjective. It's still objective, it's just disputed. Subjective means relating to a specific person or subject. For example, let's take the statement, steak is delicious. The most common definition of the word delicious is basically equivalent to saying that you personally like the taste. In that sense, deliciousness is subjective. If I say steak is delicious, then it's true. When people who don't like steak, communists probably, they make that same statement, it might be false. Perhaps there would be some other implied subject for deliciousness to apply to in different contexts, like, for example, a chef saying that phrase might mean that the average person that he's likely to serve likes steak. The point is that deliciousness can be described as subjective because it describes not an aspect of the thing itself so much as the way that someone reacts or the response in someone's mind to some characteristics of that thing. This is in contrast to a term which is objective, which describes something about the object in question rather than just how it interacts with a subject. For example, squareness is an objective property. If we're both looking at a shape which has 4 equal sides and 4 equal angles, then it doesn't matter who says it's a square, it simply is one. As you might have noticed, this is a purely linguistic distinction. To say that morality is subjective, therefore, only says something about the word. Now, it's not that that's unimportant. We need to understand words. So what would it mean for morality to be subjective in the same way that deliciousness is? Well, it would mean that morality simply describes a reaction we have to something, rather than the thing itself. To say that something is immoral in this sense is to say that it offends our moral sensibilities. We see someone drop-kick a baby, for example, and we feel bad. We have a bad feeling about that. Not just any bad feeling, by the way. This is not just the idea that morality is when we like something and immorality is when we dislike something, but a specific bad thing. The feeling of being morally offended, let's say. We can all intuitively distinguish between different kinds of bad feelings that we have. When we see someone eat something off the floor, we feel disgust. When we see a dangerous animal, we feel fear. But we have no problem telling the difference between these things. Similarly, you probably have no problem distinguishing the feeling you had when I mentioned someone drop-kicking a baby. I mean, this is being created for the internet, so I bet some of you laughed, but you probably still feel at least a little of the negative feeling called moral offense, which you can tell is different from other negative feelings like disgust and fear. But hold on. Aren't I supposed to be arguing that moral subjectivism is moral nihilism? So far it sounds like our subjectivist, it sounds like he believes that morality is as real as deliciousness or scariness. In what sense is that moral nihilism? Well, when two people are having a moral argument, they are trying to convince one another through arguments. Appeals to consequences and principles that are supposed to convince their interlocutors that what they thought was moral was in fact immoral, or vice versa. That would make no sense for deliciousness. I wouldn't try to tell you that the meal that you thought you enjoyed eating, which you thought was delicious by your standards, actually tasted really bad to you and you didn't enjoy it at all. This is because your direct experience is the only determining factor that decides whether something is, to you, delicious. For moral arguments to make sense, there must be something other than our pure subjective experience that we're talking about. If you're saying that morality is purely subjective, you're saying that there is no external aspect of the world which we are referring to when we talk about morality. So the moral subjectivist is a moral nihilist, at least with respect to the kind of morality that we refer to when making moral arguments. Refuting moral nihilism. Having corralled might makes right, moral subjectivism, and explicit moral nihilism into the same spot, I can now take out all three in one fell swoop. In step 1, I point out that nihilists do things. Not only do they do things, but they do things for reasons. That is to say, they have things which they value more highly than other things, and they take actions which they believe will result in a net gain in the fulfillment of those values. For example, they value eating a sandwich, and they value that more highly than being lazy, and so they get up and they make the sandwich, which is they trade the effort for the sandwich. In step 2, I concede to moral nihilism completely. A bold strategy when arguing against something, you might agree, but it's actually surprisingly effective in a lot of hard-to-analyze positions. That's right, nihilists. There is no morality. Your hard-nosed realism has won out against our silly romantics who believe in ethics. Now, we're ready for step 3. Analysing situations we used to apply morality to, except without such foolish superstitions. How would a nihilist doctor decide whether to steal the organs from a healthy man in order to save the lives of 5 dying patients? It's a common moral hypothetical. Well, the nihilist doctor, of course, would just go with his preferences. As we discussed before, despite being a moral nihilist, he still personally values some things above others. And so it depends on preferences such as whether he would rather 1 person to die or 5. It might sound obvious which he'd prefer, but there's no reason to prefer fewer people dying to more. As the rational, realistic nihilists we now are, we know that reason cannot tell us what to value. After all, it is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger. That being said, do you prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of your finger? I don't think I do. I would also prefer, all else equal, for my actions to cause fewer people to die than more. So maybe I would kill the man and redistribute his organs. Then again, I would also prefer that, all else equal, not to be caught killing people. Not just for my own sake, but if I damage the reputation of the medical profession, or even just my own reputation as a doctor, and as a result people didn't get medical treatment that they needed, I would feel really bad about that. Also, let's not forget that I might screw up the surgeries. I'd really rather not have the whole lot of them die on me. That's also ignoring the question of how many years of life the healthy patient would have compared to how many years of life the sick patients would get on their stolen organs, not to mention quality of life. That's right, quality of life. I mean, I would personally prefer that people have better lives rather than worse ones, all else equal. In fact, that's kind of the reason that I would prefer people not to die in the first place. If people to die, then I feel like their quality of life is effectively dropped to zero. But how to weigh up the quality of life brought on by longer life against the quality of life brought on by not having painful surgery complications? More pressingly, how to weigh up any of these benefits interpersonally? A year to one man is not necessarily the same as a year to another. The question of how to compare values interpersonally to weigh up the values of one man against the values of another is a tough one, but it is not entirely unanswerable. It can't be. We seem to manage interpersonal value judgments all the time. If I have a spare concert ticket to give to one of my friends, I'll probably give it to the one who likes the band more. That is an interpersonal value comparison, and it seems to make intuitive sense. There are more questions I could ask, but let's pause and take stock of what we've got so far. You might have noticed that all of these questions come from the same source. The fact that one of these things I value is the fulfillment of values. If I imagine a world in which more people have their values fulfilled versus one in which fewer people do, then all else equal, I prefer the former. This is sounding dangerously like utilitarianism, or at least consequentialism. But of course, I have conceded to nihilism, so it can't possibly be that, can it? No, this is all just based on my own personal values and not on morality, right? Besides, when I think about what might happen if everyone acted on a simple value fulfillment maximizing basis, it doesn't sound too good. I imagine that every time you went to the doctor there was the danger that he'd kill you and cut out your organs. I don't think too many people would go to the doctor, and paradoxically that would result in fewer values being fulfilled. Now, I, the nihilist doctor, am not everyone, so my acting on a simple value maximization basis is not going to necessarily result in that awful world that I'm envisioning. But I would certainly be contributing to such a world, and I'm not sure I even want to do that. I suppose what I really want to do is to act in a way such that I'm contributing to a world in which values are maximally fulfilled. This is sounding dangerously like deontology, but of course I have conceded to nihilism, so it can't possibly be that. This is all just based on my personal values, not on morality. But hold on. What exactly is morality? Because the reasoning I'm doing here sounds one heck of a lot like it. The reasoning is not, by the way, broadly how I fulfill my values. Right? That's not the reasoning I'm doing. It's specifically how do I fulfill those values that pertain to other values. One might call that the analysis of the fulfillment of meta-values. It does start from my subjective preferences, but it's an objective fact that some actions I take will fulfill these meta-values more effectively than others, which is to say that some actions I take will more effectively maximize the value fulfillment of all values which I care about better than others.
What if, just hypothetically, we were to define morality as the analysis of the fulfillment of meta-values? We have already seen that both deontology and consequentialism fit nicely with that definition. And most moral theories can be thought of as variants of one of those two. Perhaps the most prominent exceptions are theological theories of ethics. So what about those? Well, those determine good and bad based on what God wants. Or in other words, the fulfillment of God's values. My definition appears to handle that too. An obvious criticism at this point is that I'm just redefining morality in order to make it sound real and objective. But am I really redefining morality? I don't think so. Merriam-Webster defines morality in a number of ways, but all of them pass the buck to another word. For example, conformity to ideals of right human conduct. This just passes the buck to right. What does right mean in this context? Well, right and wrong need to be defined in terms of a goal. If there is an objectively right and wrong way to build a table, for example, assuming that the goal is to have a table which stands up. But in a moral argument, building a table which stands up is probably not the assumed goal by which we are judging right and wrong. If I said your action is immoral because it does not result in a table which stands up, you would probably say that it is bad carpentry, but it is not necessarily bad morally. On the other hand, if I said that your action is immoral because it prevents people from fulfilling their values, then that might sound a little bit more sensible. And so I'm sticking with it. That is my conception of morality. The analysis of the fulfillment of meta-values. Taking morality for a test drive. This might sound like it's wheeling its way back to moral subjectivism. If we all have different meta-values, then surely what is moral to me will depend on my meta-values, and what's moral to you will depend on yours. There's some truth to this argument. Like all concepts, there are aspects of subjectivity and objectivity involved. However, I have three counterpoints to this in general. Number one, my conception of morality is the analysis of how to fulfill meta-values, not simply the meta-values themselves. Your meta-values may be subjective, but it is an objective fact whether a given course of action will or will not successfully fulfill them. For example, you may value your friend fulfilling his values. That is a meta-value. Your friend likes beer and hates getting stabbed in the neck. It would be therefore moral for you to get him a beer and immoral for you to stab him in the neck. 2. There are commonalities between values of people. This means that the same objective analysis of how to fulfill these values will often be the same between people. Most people would agree, yeah, I don't like my friend getting stabbed in the neck. Number 3, most importantly, there are important objective statements that we can make about the fulfillment of values irrespective of what those values are. In the example for this third point, we will be taking our new morality for a test drive to see if it can produce moral standards that we recognize as such. My favourite moral standard comes from our good old friend voluntarism, a concept which I will never tire of repeating until everyone starts realizing how indispensable it is. If two people voluntarily engage in an interaction, each person must value what he got out of it more than what he put into it. Otherwise, he would not have engaged in it. If you trade your apple for my orange, you must value my orange more than your apple. If you play a game with me, you must value the enjoyment you got out of the game more than the time you spent playing it. This tells us that to the extent that we place a positive value on people fulfilling their values, we have some reason to expect voluntary interactions to be good no matter what those values are. We just derived something that sounds suspiciously like a moral principle starting from simple and obvious premises. That's a big deal when trying to refute moral nihilism, so let's run through it again. 1. If you care about the fulfillment of people's values, which is to say if you have meta-values, then you have some reason to favour voluntary interactions.
2. You objectively do care about the fulfillment of people's values. Therefore, 3. You have some reason to favour voluntary interactions. We have established a moral principle, and it is objectively true that you should use it, given goals which you actually have. It is only a general principle. I have only said that you have some reason to favour voluntary interactions. Not that all interactions must be voluntary. But general principles are still very useful. If a general principle is sound, then you should go with it, unless the reasons to do otherwise outweigh the reasons behind the principle. Perhaps there are other principles which will outweigh our voluntarist principle in certain situations. But the voluntarist principle still provides an objectively right and wrong way to act in the absence of other reasoning. Let's apply this moral principle to the hypothetical from earlier. Should you harvest the organs from one healthy patient in order to save 5 sick patients? Well, according to our general voluntarist principle, no. The healthy patient does not consent to it, does not agree to it, and so it is not voluntary. Unless and until we have a countervailing principle, you have the answer to your question. You have meta-values. A general principle which helps you fulfill those meta-values is the voluntarist principle. Killing the healthy patient for his organs violates the voluntarist principle. Therefore, you should not kill him. Perhaps you would argue that whether someone agrees to things is not the only way we can determine what people value. And so there is some other countervailing principle that will tell us that we in fact should butcher the innocent man in this case. I will not comment on whether you are right or wrong about that, because by making that argument, you would already be conceding to me that there is an objectively correct way of achieving the goal of fulfilling meta-values. That is to say, by our working definition of morality, there is an objectively moral course of action. You are just disagreeing on what that course of action is. So, after our test drive, what do you think? Morality as the analysis of how to fulfill meta-values. It seems to handle pretty well, doesn't it? I have found at this point that skeptics of this model of morality will usually assert that this doesn't count as morality at all, even though the model allows us to engage in all the arguments that people usually call moral arguments, and even produces principles that sound indistinguishable from recognizable moral principles. Sometimes they'll say, it's not morality because it doesn't give a reason that you ought to be moral. Except it does. Once again, ought must be in reference to a given goal. You ought to do X to achieve Y. You do have the goal of fulfilling other people's values and your own values, and that is some reason you ought to analyze how to fulfill people's values in general. To me, it seems like some people think it doesn't feel like morality as soon as you define something too clearly. But unfortunately for those people, facts don't care about your feelings. Another critique is that my conception of morality is redundant, because it is simply describing the fulfillment of your own values, and we already have a way of describing that. But that is not what my conception of morality is. My conception of morality is the methodology for fulfilling a specific subcategory of our values, specifically values which pertain to other values. Carpentry is also a methodology fulfilling a subcategory of our values, specifically the values which can be fulfilled by wooden furniture. What is good carpentry? Good carpentry is a good methodology for producing, among other things, tables which stand up. And why tables that stand up? Because those are the types of tables we value. Similarly, what is good morality? Well, good morality is a good methodology for fulfilling meta-values, because we do, in fact, hold meta-values. If my conception of morality is redundant, then so is our conception of carpentry. It's also worth clarifying that my conception of morality does not necessarily advocate self-sacrifice. You are interested in other people fulfilling their values, but you are also interested in you fulfilling your own. A good meta-value analysis will include your own values as well. A good way to illustrate this is to point out that a man who does nothing to help or hurt anyone else, but does make himself happy, is a good man by our current definition. Conclusion. This does not mean that morality must necessarily be defined in terms of fulfillment of meta-values. Please don't go away from this thinking that I have just solved morality. I am aware that I have not. Perhaps there is some other valid conception of morality which doesn't define itself by meta-values at all. After all, definitions are always imperfect simplifications of the intuitions and associations that a word actually provokes within our minds. However, the fact that my definition seems to work seamlessly in every argument about the morality of a given action makes it pretty hard to argue that it's not a valid conception of morality. And that is all that's necessary to refute moral nihilism. One valid conception of morality which is objectively determinable and provides prescriptive oughts for you to fulfill. You objectively do hold some meta-values, and there are objectively right and wrong ways to fulfill these meta-values. Therefore, morality is a real thing that you should consider in your life. And even if you're a moral nihilist, even an avowed one, you undoubtedly already do.